In this episode, we talk about the difference between return of capital and return on capital, whether you need a pre-existing substantive relationship, and my favorite, you could actually go from a 506B to a 506C. Hey everyone, it's Mauricio Rauld, and you're watching episode 4 of the Ask Mauricio Show, your weekly real estate syndication Q&A show. And man, it's the end of January already. Hard to believe how fast time flies. Super excited. I'm actually heading out to Phoenix today to go meet our new puppy, getting a second golden retriever. We've already got one. She's about 9 or 10 months old. So excited about that. And just a quick trip over there, meet him, and then pick him up next weekend. So super excited about that, but also excited about getting into your questions for this week. So without further ado, Courtney, let's go to the first question.
Michael asks, must you always have a pre-existing relationship with your investor, even for a 506B?
This is a great question, and it's an interesting one too. Most people believe that you must have a pre-existing substantive relationship, when in fact you don't have to. Having a pre-existing substantive relationship is one of the ways you can show that you did not genuinely solicit or advertise, but it's not the exclusive way. Now, to be fair, probably 99% of the times you're going to rely on having a pre-existing substantive relationship. And as we've talked about in the past, it's one of the few times that the SEC is actually giving us some really clear guidance on what constitutes having a substantive relationship and what doesn't. But the reality is there are other ways. The rule itself says you cannot generally solicit and advertise. It doesn't say anything actually about having a pre-existing relationship. That sort of has evolved over the years. But an example of this would be, a referral. If you've got an investor that's invested with you before and he or she decides to, make an introduction to a friend or a family member or a fellow investor and says, hey, Johnny, please meet the syndicator. I've been working with the syndicator for many years, and makes the connection, you won't have a pre-existing substantive relationship with that referral, but you have not advertised or generally solicited either. So you haven't violated the advertising rules. Now, important to remember, you cannot pay that person for the referral. That's a whole different issue that we've talked about in the past. So you can't pay for that referral, but when that person makes the introduction, you won't have that pre-existing relationship, will not have violated the general solicitation rules. Another way, the SEC has recognized that there's these things that are called sort of informal personal networks that develop, and you may have a relationship with somebody in that personal network, informal network. And if that person, again, refers you to somebody in that network, you can rely on the relationship you have with that person, that original person, to sort of impute that the person that referring you is sophisticated and can actually invest in your deal. So again, it's one of the big misnomers. You do not have to have a pre-existing substantive relationship, even though most of the time, or 99% of the time, that's what you have.
Jennifer asks, what is the difference between return of capital and return on investments?
So this is a subtle but very, very important distinction. I actually call it return of capital versus return on investment. Those are kind of the two things. So return on investment, I think, is what most people would consider your typical return structure, which means if I give you $100,000 in an investment and you give me, let's say in the first year, $10,000, let's say a 10% return, I still have $100,000 invested with you. So at the end of the investment, when all is said and done, you still owe me that original $100,000. You're just paying me a return on investment, kind of a cash on cash return. What's starting to happen, I probably noticed it about 3 or 4 years ago, is this issue of return of capital. And that's fine as long as we disclose it. But return of capital means you're actually, in those initial years that you're making a payment to me, that actually goes to reduce the amount of money I gave you. So for example, in the same example, I gave you $100,000 and then you give me $10,000 as my return. If it's a return of capital, well, now instead of owing me $100,000, you only owe me $90. And if the next year you give me another $10,000, now you owe me $80. So you go from 100 to 90 to 80. So let's say 5 years from now, the syndicator sells the property. Well, you're always going to return the investor's money first before you start splitting profits. Well, you only owe me 50 grand because you've been paying me $10,000 for the last 5 years. So that original $100,000 came all the way down to 50. So at the time of exit, you're only returning $50,000 of my capital first before then going into the splits. Essentially what you're doing is you're pushing the risk you're pushing the passive investor out to the risk curve because you're just returning their own money at the beginning, and the real returns are going to be on the back end. From a tax perspective, there's been some debate as to whether there's a benefit for the investor on the tax side because you're actually returning my capital. I've spoken to many CPAs and they all, as usual, have different opinions on that. Some people say it does matter, some people don't. But here are probably the two most important things to consider when you're doing the return of capital versus the return on investment. Number one, you cannot tell the investor in your offering documents that you're giving them a cash-on-cash return. That would be really a misleading statement. So if I give you $100,000 and you give me $10,000 in year one, that's not a cash-on-cash return of 10% because you're just giving me my money back. So that's very important to distinguish and make it very clear in your offering docs. Now you can call it a cash distribution or cash flow, whatever you want to call it, but cash-on-cash is misleading because I'm not really making 10% on that 100 grand, it's just being reduced. I'm kind of getting my money back, or that capital being reduced. The other important metric it comes in is on the preferred return. Many times the preferred return is based on that amount that you owe them, what I call sort of unrecovered capital contribution. So if I contribute $100,000 and you give me a 10% return or a 10% pref, you're going to give me $10,000. But in our example, if I fast forward 5 years from now and you only owe me I'm down to $50,000, well, that 10% is going to be on that $50,000, so that my preferred return is going to start coming down every year. Not automatically. There are still ways you can continue to pay the investor 10% on the original amount, just the way you disclose it in your documentation. But again, just make sure you're very clear in your disclosure documents how exactly you're treating the return or your distribution, and also how you're treating the preferred return, whether that's based on the initial capital that you gave me or the unrecovered capital that keeps going down year after year. But great question, because that's something that there's a lot of confusion about, and I get that question quite a lot.
Kevin asks, can you switch from one exemption to another in the middle of a raise?
All right, Kevin, actually that's one of my favorite questions these days, because there's actually some new rules that have come out. I was going to say recently, but it's been almost a year now. But look, if you're doing a 506C first, and you've started to advertise and you're starting to generally solicit, then obviously you cannot go from a 506C to a 506B, because the minute you advertise, you've blown the exemption for 506B. Now, if you haven't advertised yet and you just started as a 506C but haven't really, maybe you've sold it to a couple of accredited investors without generally solicited advertising, then it is possible to go back and amend the documents and proceed as a 506B, because you haven't blown that exemption, so that is an option. What's really exciting though is that as of March of last year, the SEC has come out now and said, look, you can actually start with a 506B in your offering and then switch over to a 506C, even though you've already taken non-accredited investors in the deal. So it is possible for you to start with a 506B, fully comply with 506B, meaning no advertising, no general solicitation. Generally, you have a pre-existing relationship with those investors, no more than 35 non-accredited, again, following the letter of the law regarding 506B. But at some point, you can terminate that offering, terminate the 506B, pivot, and moving forward, start offering an under 506C. And again, at that point, complying fully with the 506C rules, which means you're going to be able to advertise, you're going to be able to generally solicit, but you're going to be limited to accredited investors only, and you must take reasonable steps to verify that they are accredited. In the ideal world, you figure this out on the front end. So right at the beginning of the offering, you let everybody know that you're planning on starting with a 506B, and you reserve the right to switch to a 506C. That way we can set it up better and make it very clear, because the critical part here is to really draw a very clear line between the 506B and the 506C, because anytime it gets a little bit gray, you may run into some issues. But that's something that's relatively new. Not too many people are talking about it, but that's why I wanted to share with you. All right, so as always, if you've got any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comment, and we'll look at those and hopefully answer those in a future video. And until then, we'll see you next week.